Empty hands. Why your greatest loss is God's new beginning. One evening, as the sun was slowly setting beyond the hills, an old farmer sat outside his small wooden house. His hands were rough from years of hard work, and his face carried the quiet wisdom of someone who had seen both blessings and storms. A young traveler approached the farmer and said, "Sir, I have heard that you are a wise man. My life has fallen apart. I have lost my work, my plans, and everything I believed would make me successful. Tell me, why would God allow such loss?" The old farmer looked at the young man for a moment, then quietly picked up a clay cup sitting on the table beside him. The cup was filled to the very top with water. Without saying a word, the farmer lifted a jug and tried to pour more water into the cup. The water immediately spilled over the edges and ran onto the ground. The traveler frowned. "Why are you doing that?" The farmer smiled gently and said, "Because this cup is like a human heart." The traveler looked confused. The farmer continued, "When the cup is already full, nothing new can enter it. No matter how valuable the water is, there is simply no space for it." Then the farmer slowly emptied the cup onto the ground. The traveler watched silently as the water disappeared into the dry soil. The farmer then lifted the jug again and poured fresh water into the empty cup. This time the cup filled perfectly, holding every drop. The farmer handed the cup to the traveler and said softly, "Sometimes God empties the cup of our lives, not because He wants to leave us empty, but because He wants to fill us with something better." The traveler stared at the cup in his hands. The farmer continued speaking, his voice calm but powerful. Many people hold tightly to things they believe will give them security: jobs, plans, achievements, possessions. But when those things fill their lives completely, there is no room left for God's greater purpose. The traveler asked quietly, "So loss is not always punishment?" The farmer shook his head. "No, sometimes loss is preparation." He pointed toward a field behind his house. "Look at that soil. Before a farmer plants new seeds, he must first clear the field. Old crops are removed. The soil is turned over. It looks messy, empty, and even destroyed. But only then can new life grow." The young traveler slowly began to understand. The farmer leaned forward and said something the traveler would remember for the rest of his life. When God removes something from your hands, do not think He has abandoned you. Often He is simply making room for something you could not have received before. The traveler sat quietly, holding the cup, watching the last light of the sunset disappear, and for the first time since his life had fallen apart, he felt hope, because maybe, just maybe, his empty hands were not the end of his story. Maybe they were the beginning of something new. What if the worst day of your life was secretly the first day of your miracle? What if the moment you lost everything, your job, your security, your relationships, even your sense of purpose, was not the end of your story, but the exact moment heaven began writing a new chapter? Think about it. Why does God sometimes allow our hands to become completely empty? Why does life strip away the things we worked for, prayed for, believed in? Why does everything fall apart, right when we thought everything was finally coming together? Here's the truth most people never understand. God cannot fill hands that are already full. And sometimes, the greatest blessing you will ever receive begins the moment you lose everything you thought you needed. Tonight's story is about a man who discovered that truth in the most painful way imaginable. A man who lost his career, his home, his identity, and stood alone one night with nothing left in his hands. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly see in that moment, was that heaven had already begun preparing something greater than he had ever dreamed. And by the time this story ends, you might realize something shocking about your own life, that the loss you're grieving may actually be the beginning of the miracle you've been praying for. So listen carefully, because this story might change the way you see your struggles forever. Pause. The rain was falling hard that night. Not the gentle kind of rain that comforts you. No. This was the kind that felt cold and relentless. The kind that matched exactly how Daniel Carter felt inside. He stood on the sidewalk outside his office building in downtown Chicago, 34 years old. And for the first time in his life, he had absolutely no idea where he was going next. Just 10 minutes earlier, his boss had looked him in the eyes and said words Daniel never expected to hear. "I'm sorry. We have to let you go." 10 simple words. 10 words that erased 12 years of work. 12 years of loyalty. 12 years of believing he was building something stable. Gone. Just like that. Pause. Now here's something interesting. Did you know that according to psychological research, humans experience job loss with almost the same emotional intensity as losing a loved one? Because when we lose a job, we don't just lose income. We lose identity. We lose routine. We lose the story we were telling ourselves about our future. And Daniel was feeling every bit of that loss as he stood there in the rain. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was his mother calling. He stared at the screen, but he couldn't answer. How do you explain that your entire life just collapsed in 10 minutes? So he did the only thing he could think of. He started walking. Pause. Have you ever noticed something strange about the way God works? When everything feels stable, we rarely change. We stay comfortable. We stay predictable. But the moment everything breaks, suddenly we become open to something new. The Bible is filled with stories like this. Joseph had to be thrown into a pit before he reached the palace. Moses had to spend 40 years in the wilderness before he could lead a nation. David had to face giants before he wore a crown. Loss has always been part of God's preparation process. But when you're living through it, it doesn't feel like preparation. It feels like punishment. And that's exactly how Daniel felt that night. Pause. By the time he reached his apartment building, the rain had soaked through his jacket. He climbed the stairs slowly, unlocked the door, and stepped into the quiet darkness of the place he had called home for 6 years. He dropped his keys on the table, sat down on the couch, and stared at the wall. No television. No music. Just silence. And thoughts. Dangerous thoughts. What if I never recover from this? What if everything I've built was meaningless? What if God has forgotten about me? Listen. Maybe you've asked those questions too. And if you have, you're not alone. Because doubt often visits us in our darkest moments. Even the greatest people of faith have wrestled with it. But here's something remarkable. Sometimes, God does his best work in the silence after everything falls apart. Pause. 3 weeks passed. Daniel sent out dozens of job applications. Nothing. Not even a response. His savings were shrinking. His confidence was shrinking even faster. One evening, he walked past a small church on his way home. The lights inside were on. Through the window, he could see a few people sitting quietly in the pews. For reasons he couldn't explain, he stepped inside. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was desperation. Or maybe, just maybe, God was gently guiding his steps. Pause. An elderly pastor stood near the front. He noticed Daniel and smiled warmly. "You look like someone carrying a heavy burden," the pastor said softly. Daniel tried to smile, but something about the kindness in that man's voice broke the wall he had been holding up for weeks. "I lost everything," Daniel admitted. "My job, my direction, everything I thought my life was supposed to be." The pastor nodded slowly. Then he said something Daniel would never forget. "Sometimes God empties our hands, so we finally have space to receive what he truly wants to give us." Pause. Daniel frowned slightly. "I don't understand." The pastor gestured toward the cross behind the altar. "Think about the disciples on the day Jesus died," he said. "They believed everything was over. Their hope, their future, their purpose, gone. But what looked like the greatest loss in human history became the greatest victory the world has ever known." Pause. Daniel sat quietly. The words lingered in his mind. What if his story wasn't over? What if this loss wasn't the end? Pause. Over the next few weeks, Daniel kept returning to that church. Not because all his problems disappeared. They hadn't. But something inside him was changing. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" he began asking, "What might God be preparing me for?" Pause. And that question changed everything. Because when your perspective shifts, your path often changes too. One afternoon, the pastor asked Daniel a simple question. If money wasn't an issue, what would you spend your life doing? Daniel laughed. "No one's ever asked me that before." "Try answering it," the pastor said. Daniel thought for a moment. Then he said something surprising. "I think I would help people who feel lost, the way I did." Pause. And here's the shocking part. That answer would eventually lead Daniel into a mission that reached thousands of people. But he couldn't see that yet. All he could see was that his hands were empty. Pause. Listen carefully, because this next truth might change how you see your struggles. When God removes something from your life, he's not always punishing you. Sometimes, he's repositioning you. Sometimes the door that closed was never meant to be your final destination. Sometimes the path you lost was never meant to be your purpose. And sometimes, God has to dismantle the life you planned, so he can build the life you were created for. Pause. Years later, Daniel would look back on that rainy night outside his office building and realize something incredible. The worst day of his life had actually been the beginning of the greatest journey he would ever experience. Because losing his job forced him to discover something deeper than career success: purpose, faith, calling, and a life that impacted thousands of people searching for hope. Pause. So if you're watching this right now, and you feel like everything has fallen apart, listen carefully. Your story might not be ending. It might just be beginning. Pause. Maybe the relationship that ended made room for the one that will truly honor your heart. Maybe the opportunity that disappeared cleared the path for something greater. Maybe the dream that collapsed was only preparing you for the calling God designed specifically for you. Because God specializes in resurrection stories. He turns graves into gardens. He turns endings into beginnings. And he turns empty hands into vessels for miracles. Pause. So if your hands feel empty tonight, don't panic. Look up, because God might be preparing to place something extraordinary in them. Pause. And if this story spoke to your heart today, we invite you to continue this journey of hope with us. Please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who may need encouragement, and subscribe to our channel, Parables of Hope. Your support helps us continue spreading stories that inspire faith, healing, and purpose across the world. And we truly believe that every share, every comment, every prayer, God is still working behind the scenes. And remember this powerful truth. The chapter you're living today is not the final chapter of your story. God is still writing. And sometimes, the most beautiful beginnings come after the most painful endings. Listen. The young traveler sat there for a long moment, holding the clay cup in his hands. The water inside it reflected the fading colors of the sunset, trembling slightly with every small movement. Something about that simple moment felt strangely powerful. The traveler finally spoke again. "But what if the loss still hurts?" he asked quietly. "What if the emptiness feels unbearable?" The old farmer nodded slowly, as though he had been expecting that question. "My son," he said gently, "emptiness always feels painful at first. But let me tell you another story." The traveler leaned forward, listening carefully. The farmer pointed toward a tall tree standing alone near the edge of the field. "Many years ago," he began, "a storm came through this valley. A terrible storm. The wind was so strong it tore branches from the trees and scattered them across the land." He paused, remembering. "After the storm passed, I walked through this very field and saw that the strongest-looking tree had lost nearly all its branches. It looked ruined, broken, almost dead." The traveler glanced at the tree, imagining what it must have looked like. "I felt sorry for it," the farmer continued. "I thought that tree would never recover." The traveler asked quietly, "But it did?" The farmer smiled. "Yes." He pointed upward. "Look closely." The traveler looked again. The branches of the tree were now wide and strong, covered with green leaves that moved gently in the evening wind. "That storm did something strange," the farmer said. "When the branches were torn away, the tree began growing deeper roots, stronger roots than it had ever had before." The traveler's eyes widened slightly. "Sometimes," the farmer continued softly, "God allows storms in our lives because He wants our roots to grow deeper." He leaned back in his chair. "If life is always comfortable, faith remains shallow. But when everything shakes, when everything falls apart, that is when we learn to hold on to God more tightly than ever before." The traveler looked down at the cup again. "And once our roots grow deep," the farmer continued, "we become stronger than the storm that once nearly destroyed us." The wind rustled softly through the fields. For the first time since arriving, the traveler felt a small sense of peace entering his heart. But the farmer was not finished. He slowly stood up and walked toward the edge of the field. "Come," he said. The traveler followed him. They walked across the quiet land until they reached a patch of freshly turned soil. The ground looked empty, dark, bare. The farmer knelt down and picked up a small seed from a pouch in his pocket. "Tell me something," he asked the traveler. "What happens to a seed before it becomes a tree?" The traveler thought for a moment. "It is planted in the ground," Yes, the farmer said. But what happens to the seed itself? The traveler hesitated. The farmer gently placed the seed in the traveler's hand. The seed must break, he said quietly. If the seed refuses to break, it will never grow. The traveler stared at the tiny seed resting on his palm. The farmer's voice grew deeper, almost like the voice of a storyteller sharing an ancient truth. A seed that stays whole remains safe, but it remains small forever. But a seed that breaks open becomes something far greater than itself. The traveler slowly closed his fingers around the seed. So you are saying, he began. Yes, the farmer said gently. Sometimes God allows our lives to break because something greater is about to grow. The two of them stood there in silence. The evening sky had turned dark blue now, and the first stars were beginning to appear. After a while, the traveler asked one last question. But how do we trust God when everything feels uncertain? The farmer looked up at the sky. Then he said something that sounded almost like a whisper carried by the wind. Faith is not believing that you understand everything. Faith is believing that God does. He turned toward the traveler again. You see, my son, God often writes the most beautiful chapters of our lives on pages we never planned to turn. The traveler looked out across the empty field. But now the field did not look empty anymore. It looked full of possibility. Seeds hidden beneath the soil. Roots growing where no one could see. A future quietly forming beneath the surface. And suddenly, the traveler understood something that had felt impossible only hours earlier. Maybe losing everything had not been the end. Maybe it had only been the beginning. He looked down at his hands. They were empty. But for the first time, he did not feel afraid, because now he realized something powerful. Empty hands are not useless. Empty hands are ready, ready to receive, ready to grow, ready for the blessings God is preparing. And sometimes, the greatest miracle God can give a person is the courage to trust Him when their hands are empty. The traveler thanked the old farmer and began walking down the road under the quiet stars. He did not know exactly where life would take him next, but he carried something far more valuable than certainty. He carried hope, and hope, when placed in God's hands, has the power to change everything. And now, dear listener, before this story comes to an end, let me ask you something important. Are you holding on to something that God may be asking you to release? Are you grieving a loss that might actually be preparing the ground for a greater blessing? Sometimes what feels like the closing of a door is actually God opening a path we never imagined. So if today your hands feel empty, do not lose the faith. God may be preparing them to receive something far greater than what you lost. And if this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need encouragement, and subscribe to our channel, Parables of Hope. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that inspire faith, hope, and courage in people all around the world. We also invite you to watch the other inspiring stories on our channel, Parables of Hope, because every video is created to remind us that even in the darkest moments, God is still working behind the scenes. Your support truly means everything to us. When you like, share, and subscribe, you help this message of hope reach someone who might be struggling tonight, someone who might feel lost, someone who might need exactly this reminder. Together, we can spread faith across the world. And remember this truth as you leave this story tonight. Sometimes God empties our hands, only so He can fill them with something greater than we ever imagined. May your heart be filled with peace. May your faith grow stronger with every challenge. And may the empty places in your life soon be filled with God's extraordinary blessings. Until next time, keep believing, because with God, even the greatest loss can become the beginning of a miracle.